Welcome back to the video series on snake identification. This one is devoted to the copperhead, one of only two venomous species in western North Carolina. Of course, we'll be focusing mainly on identification, and you're helping you learn to correctly identify this particular species, but we will talk also about some natural history notes, interesting facts, things of that nature as we go along, and hopefully you'll have a much better understanding and appreciation for this amazing species after we finish with this. A few random facts about the copperhead. The copperhead occurs statewide, every county in North Carolina. And in this area, it's found pretty much in appropriate habitat everywhere you go, regardless of elevation. I found copperheads at the top of Mount Pisgah, literally in the gravel inside the chain link fence around the towers on top of Mount Pisgah. I've seen them in Mitchell State Park, and they're certainly abundant as you go further downslope. So they're found pretty much anywhere that we hike or recreate in the outdoors in the Pisgah, Nantahala, Asheville vicinity. We're going to see potentially copperheads. They are medically significant as far as their venom is concerned, and a copperhead bite is no laughing matter. We'll talk more about that later in the presentation. But remember that the risk of death by a copperhead bite for an adult is extremely low, even though the copperhead does account for the greatest number of bites per year in North Carolina. Another thing to realize is that the mountainous area has some of the lowest incidence of copperhead bites in humans. The triangle area in the middle of the state always leads the state in copperhead bites, which is not at all surprising when you think about the number of how fast those areas are growing, the suburban areas that are being developed rapidly from former farmland and forest land, and suddenly there's a housing development and populated oftentimes by people who are new to rural or suburban life and don't really know much about the wildlife that they have suddenly inherited. So that's a recipe for disaster, and so that's why Mecklenburg County, Wake County, those areas down in that part of the state always lead the state in copperhead bites. The reason that we want to really focus on knowing how to identify copperheads is there's a couple of reasons, and if we think about these, it makes sense. If you know what copperheads look like, if you really understand their behavior and their visual appearance, it will be much less likely that you will accidentally encounter one by putting your hand on it, by stepping on it, by sitting on it, by coming in close contact with it accidentally. And that's what we're really trying to avoid here, is we're trying to avoid accidental contact with an animal that you simply don't see. And the second part is that knowing what copperheads truly look like will help you to separate them from the many different species of non-venomous snakes in the area that many folks who are uneducated as far as snakes go will claim are copperheads, and they definitely aren't. And so that was de-escalate a lot of your snake contacts. You say, well, no, I don't know what that is, but it's definitely not a copperhead. So hopefully we can get to that level at a minimum and make everybody a lot more comfortable as they move around on the trails and in the natural areas in this part of the state. Remember, as we go through this, don't forget the things we learned in that first video about head geometry, eye placement, colors and color patterns, things of that nature. We will keep mentioning those as we go through this as far as identification keys and whatnot. So each time I pop up a new picture, and there's a lot of pictures in this presentation, so each time I pop one up, look for those key elements and start practicing recognizing those, and hopefully by the end of this, and you'll have a good sense of how copperheads, how they look, a little bit more about them, and you'll be able to literally see them more effectively. So without any further ado then, camouflage. Camouflage is what copperheads are all about. Camouflage is their bread and butter. They are some of the most truly well camouflaged snakes in the area. Um, and it is that camouflage that allows them to be so successful. Copperhead's a remarkably successful animal. If you measure success by population size and habitat saturation, copperheads are very, very, very successful. They know very few equals among vertebrates. A study in Virginia where they radio telemetry tracked copperheads with radio telemetry. They had an amazing amount of really interesting new revelations about copperheads, but several of the things that they came to conclude is these things are so well camouflaged. They would literally have a copperhead in laying on the forest floor. They knew it was right there, literally between their feet, because the radio signal was coming from straight down, and they would stand there and stare and stare and stare and never see it. And then finally, they would see it. So if they knew it was there but couldn't see it, someone walking by would have zero chance of ever seeing it. And along with that, they came to the conclusion that copperheads are much more abundant than people ever thought that they really were. That they estimated, and they were not joking when they made this estimate, that for every one copperhead that you happen to see as you're just simply casually walking through the woods, you probably have passed 50 that were so well hidden that you never saw them. Copperheads spend an awful lot of time buried in the leaves, oftentimes with no part of their body exposed, sometimes with just the tip of the snout sticking out. It's really critical that you understand and approach the natural environment with the idea that an animal such as this could be hiding in plain sight, essentially. So running your hands in places, scratching around in the leaves with your bare hands without carefully examining that area first, things of that nature. That's where accidental copperhead bites tend to happen. So camouflage in this color pattern, this disruptive color pattern, is the hallmark of the copperheads. So as we go through this, keep that in mind. And here's a typical copperhead discovered in situ as it was found just kind of ambling along the forest floor. And if you try to put yourself in a situation as hiking by, you could possibly hike right by and never see it. And that's one of the things about copperheads. Many people tend to think that they're extremely aggressive, and they're just horribly vicious and will bite at any opportunity, and that's simply not true. Copperheads will almost never move, much less attempt to bite or defend themselves unless you actually touch them. I've discovered myself standing next to copperheads inches away without knowing that they were there, and they simply don't move. Unless you physically come into contact with them, they're going to allow that camouflage to do its job. Even if you catch them out in the open, a copperhead in the middle of a road will sit perfectly motionless, and until you make physical contact, it's probably going to remain completely motionless. So the danger from copperheads is greatly overestimated by the general public, and if they were as aggressive as people think they are, considering the number that are actually out there, no one could go in the woods. They'd shoo us off from the knees down, and we'd have no way to go anywhere. So it's a good thing that copperheads aren't nearly as aggressive as people tend to think they are. So let's talk a little bit about coloration. The previous slide showed a fairly typical copperhead as far as statewide in North Carolina, a light tan ground color with darker brown markings going across the back, and that's fairly typical, and we see that here. We see that throughout Pisgah National Forest. Brown on tan coloration is fairly common. However, as we get into the western part of the state, and especially as we go upslope into more high elevations where rocks are more common than leaves on the ground, we start to see a more gray coloration. It's better for them to blend into the rocky background using gray colors. So this individual, or a pretty individual, that's fairly typical of this area in the higher elevations, light gray on the background, these darker gray markings going across the back. So they can range, and quite variable, can range from very pale to very dark. And you'll see examples of all of those kinds of variations in this presentation. But the thing to remember is, no matter what the color is, and remember how last time we said color sometimes is helpful and sometimes not so much, and in this case not so much, no matter what the color is, the pattern typically remains the same. And the features that we've emphasized last time remain the same. Eye placement, flatness and geometry of the head, things of the head held at a 45-degree angle. Those are some of the hallmarks of copperhead heads, but the color pattern in almost every individual you encounter is going to be very much like this. Now this next slide is a very commonly seen a little infographic on the internet, and it emphasizes the one feature that most people will relate to and remember and think about when they hear about copperheads and identification, and that is the hourglass shape. These darker bands, regardless of what color they are, they're darker in color than the ground color, and they are hourglass shaped if you view them directly from above. They're wide near the belly, they narrow, there's the backbone right there, and then they widen out again on the other side, and so they're shaped like an hourglass. It might be helpful to remember that most people also know that black widow spiders, which can be dangerously venomous, also have an hourglass shape on their abdomen. And so maybe if you're trying to have something to kind of remember this little by, both of those have the hourglass, both of those are dangerously venomous, and so maybe that may help you remember that. Notice how this animal is fairly dark, looks dull, looks like it's about to shed. For that matter, but notice that the head is a little bit paler, and the copperhead has that color because, and it has the name because its head is often a more coppery, lighter brown color than the rest of the body. So this is a good infographic that emphasizes the pattern. The other thing to notice about the pattern, and this will be more important as we get into the water snakes, is notice that the number of crossbands is relatively low. We've got one or two there. They're not very precise, but a couple there, one there, and the number is relatively small. You could easily count the number of crossbands. When we get into water snake identification and we look at a water snake in the same posture, there might be 35 or 40 crossbands. It would be really quite a chore to count them all. But for this animal, you could pretty quickly get a count or a really good estimate of the number of crossbands because they tend to be fairly large and widely spaced. So pattern in copperheads, two things to remember is the hourglass shaped crossbands and the fact that they're fairly widely spaced and relatively few in number. Those are both part of this the feature we refer to as dorsal color pattern. Here's another one. You saw this picture in the previous video. This is, again, I was called to a house to remove a copperhead from under the hot tub, and there's what we saw sticking up from under the deck. And you again very clearly see the hourglass shape patterns across in the middle of the back, narrow and then wide on the sides, and so that clearly lets you know that you're looking at a copperhead. Another thing that notice about this particular picture, and especially this one, is that the scales, individual scales, look really knobby, and there's a lot of texture going on. Copperheads, all the vipers, as well as the water snakes, have a keel down the center of each scale, which gives the scale a lot of three-dimensionality, so it makes it look very rough in appearance. This would be a good feature to help you separate things like king snakes and rat snakes, which have either unkeeled or very weakly keeled scales. They tend to be much more smooth and glossy, but this real knobby appearance that you see here is very classic of vipers, but not exclusively to vipers. It's just another key, another part of the puzzle when you're looking at an animal. If you see a snake that's very glossy and shiny, it's definitely not a viper. Here's a great photograph of a copperhead from a high elevation with a very brilliantly colored head. This is unusually bright. But you can definitely see how the copperhead gets its name. Again, look at the color pattern, look at the relatively small number of blotches. Notice that the blotches are hourglass shaped, and then we see this. We see the angle of the head, the eyes on the side, the flat on the snout, the flat across the top of the head. We see all those features we talked about last time and say, okay, I'm seeing those things which lead me to this conclusion, the inescapable conclusion that this is indeed a copperhead. From an angle that is not directly from the side, such as this angle, ignore the head for a moment, notice what that looks like. A lot of people refer to that as a Hershey's Kiss because it's shaped just like a Hershey's Kiss from the side. And sometimes the blotches don't cross the back but come up and stop up here, and they look like a triangle rather than hourglass. And so if Hershey's Kisses are easier for you to remember when you're looking at copperhead, then go for it, because that's another common way to describe that color pattern. Classic view of the head, 45-degree angle from the horizontal, flat on the side. You can see the elliptical pupil there, but again, remember, that's not a great feature because you have to get mighty close to see that. There's that loreal pit, the heat-sensitive pit. Classic resting copperhead. He's alert. He's waiting for a prey item to come by, or he's on the alert and letting you know, I don't really want you near me, and I'm going to defend myself if necessary. This is a really terrific photograph taken in Linville Gorge just a few weeks ago. Classic western North Carolina copperhead. Not only do you see the Hershey's Kiss or hourglass shaped patterns going across the back, but notice that the dark gray, light gray with this light edging along that darker pattern to really make it pop out. That accentuates that, and from a distance that makes that animal just absolutely vanish. It makes it look very three-dimensional and then disrupts the pattern even more. This is classic of the western North Carolina copperhead populations, and again you see the coppery colored head. Fabulous photograph. Juvenile copperheads in their first year, possibly even into their second year, will have a tail tip which is either lemon yellow grading all the way out to sort of a lime green color, and that's a really neat little feature, and there's no other snakes in the area that have that. So if you see a very small snake, and baby copperheads, they're born in the fall, late summer and early fall, and they're not hatched from eggs, they're born alive, and they tend to be relatively large when they're born, so maybe they're already, when they're out, they're already a little bit on the chunky side, and they may already be 8 or 9 inches long. You see a small snake like that with a bright yellow tail tip, that's a good indication you're looking at a copperhead. No other snake in the area has the bright yellow tail tip like that. The neat thing about that tail tip is they use it for what's called caudal luring. Caudal is just the Latin name for tail, and luring, of course. So this little guy will sit in leaves, buried, letting his camouflage do its job. He will stick that tail tip up and wiggle it around right in front of his nose. It looks just like a caterpillar or a worm wiggling around, and it will attract the attention of potential worm predators such as frogs or lizards, which is what baby copperheads primarily feed on, frogs and lizards. And so he'll stick that tail up, wiggle it around. The unsuspecting lizard comes by, tries to grab the tail tip, and the copperhead grabs the lizard. So luring his prey right to the front of his nose, essentially, by good camouflage, holding perfectly still, and then using his tail tip as a lure. Very, very clever. Copperheads are really cool. And as we said, late in summer, copperheads are born alive. They'll hang around in the general vicinity. Mother's not actively protecting them, but they're all hanging around in the same vicinity for maybe a day or two before they begin to disperse. You can see all these little guys are with the yellow tail tips all ready to go, and they will feed if they can, and then go into torpor for the winter and pop out the next year and grow significantly in that next year. And maybe by the end of that next summer, they will have grown to the point where they lose the yellowtail tip. They may take it into the next year. Adult copperheads, like this beautiful female here, feed primarily on mice. They'll take birds, because birds on the ground can sometimes run into a copperhead that's camouflaged, but they're primarily rodent feeders. They're feeding on mice, chipmunks, things of that nature. And, you know, just because you're a copperhead doesn't mean you can't have a glamour shot. I mean, look at that. Beautiful animals. Here's a copperhead. Look again, just as a recap, look again for pattern. Look at the number and the shape of the blotches crossing the back. Look again at that head profile, the angle here, the sharp flat sides, the eyes, the supraocular scale, giving shade to the eyes, the flat surface, all those things that we talked about before, and some of the new things we just mentioned here. Just kind of take a moment and just really get a good look at that. And that's a typical copperhead resting, waiting for a meal to happen by, or maybe just sitting in the sun waiting for his last meal to digest. Remember again that that triangular head is, yeah, vipers have it, but so do angry water snakes, like this very reddish colored angry northern water snake here. So this is this goes to the idea that the number of crossbands and how widely they're spaced is significant. And we see the crossbands here, they're very widely spaced and a relatively small number of them. And try to count the number of crossbands here. There's a lot of crossbands, and oh my goodness, look, the crossbands break up as we go back. And then when we get into the water snake identification, that becomes a big deal. The crossbands become saddles and spots, saddles and spots, saddles and spots. And that is the hallmark of the local water snake species. Whereas crossbands here near the head tend to be entire, but notice that they're not at all hourglass shaped. That they tend to be narrower at the bottom and wider near the top, sort of a reverse hourglass. So this is your first hint at how we go about separating water snakes from the copperheads. So if we look at these two, if we really look at these with the right kind of eyes, the eyes that we've been trying to develop over this last few minutes in these videos, you can see these animals look nothing alike. And all you have to know is a few key features, and you say that definitely is not a copperhead. This is a very different animal, and that's the goal of this whole process in the first place. So find the copperhead. Look really carefully at all 4 specimens and make sure you see the copperhead, and then say, okay, here's why that's the copperhead. Then look at each of the others and say, here's why it's not. Let's see how successfully you can do that. So I'll give you just a moment. So these 3 species are very commonly confused with copperheads, and unfortunately often killed unnecessarily because people think they're copperheads. So let's talk about why they aren't. Let's start with this one. This time of year, this is spring, late May in the year, and juvenile rat snakes are on the move. This is a juvenile rat snake. Rat snakes turn dark, and in this area are nearly jet black all over as they become adult, but when they're born, or they're hatched, for the first 2 years, perhaps even into the 4th year, they will have this juvenile coloration, series of blotches or saddles down the back, and then spots on the side. But notice, I don't see cross bands, I don't see hourglasses at all. All I see is saddles down the back, and I see spots on the sides. They're not even connected. And that is typical of juvenile rat snake coloration. I look at the head, I don't see any of the features that copperhead should show me on the head. This is clearly not a copperhead, this is a juvenile rat snake. An adult rat snake here, this is a corn snake or red rat snake. Again, I see a series of saddles, but they're clearly not hourglass shaped. They get narrower as they go down near the belly, not wider. So they're clearly not the right shape. And the head, again, very rounded, eyes are very protruding and very obvious. these dark spots on a white background. That is very uncopperhead-like. Everything about that head is telling me that's not a viper, and so I know this is an animal that I don't need to fear. Northern water snake, very common here along the streams and in other waterways of western North Carolina. Large protruding eyes, very rounded head appearance, very minimally triangular or arrowhead shaped head. Cross bands wide at the back, narrow at the belly. So it's backwards from the hourglass. The dark bands are completely backwards. So from what I see here, this is clearly not a copperhead. And so I look here and I say, well, there he is. I see everything I need to see. I see the angles of the snout. I see the flatness of the top of the head. I see the Hershey's kisses or hourglasses as they cross the back. I see all the features, the very rough appearance of the scales. I see all the features that I need to see to identify that as a copperhead. So good. Hopefully you picked that out without too much trouble, and if not, go back and look at it some more and practice. Remember, camouflage. Remember that it's your responsibility to look around, and stumbling through the environment without paying attention to where you're putting your hands and feet is the best way to encounter a copperhead in a way that you really don't want to. And this is a classic example. Here's a copperhead sitting right here. Did you see him? There he is, right there. There's his head, right there. And he is just taking in some sun sitting on that rock. And you might be hiking along a trail and say, well, look at that rock. I'm going to sit right there. You need to look carefully first and make sure that somebody isn't there before you. Another picture of a copperhead, obviously near somebody's deck. And let me take a moment here and mention that copperheads, one of the reasons that they're so truly successful is that they really have high tolerance for human activity. Copperheads will live their entire lives in your yard, under your deck, under the steps, around outbuildings, in your barn, under your barn. And have very little problem with that. Rattlesnakes, on the other hand, really can't stand to be around where there's a lot of human activity. They are not at all tolerant in the grand scheme of things of human activity, and tend to be scarce around places with high activity levels. But copperheads embrace that. They have no problem with that. So. Just because you're at home doesn't mean that copperheads aren't something you need to keep an eye out for. So whenever you're moving around in wood piles or leaf litter and things of that nature, always remember that there's that possibility that he could be there. And just watch where you put hands, watch where you put feet. Make sure children understand to look for these kinds of things, and that the outdoors is not just a free playground. You really have to take responsibility for paying attention to what's going on and mind your surroundings. But notice, hiding in plain sight. If that animal didn't move, if you simply glanced down, you may not have noticed it, but hiding in plain sight. But again, we can see all the features we need to see. Yep, that's a copperhead. I see the cross bands. I see the head. I'm confident that I see that as a copperhead. And this picture has been making the rounds on the internet. Every once in a while it pops up, and it's a terrific example of how camouflage works. And this could be right down the center of a trail. And do you see him? There he is right there. That's his body, and there's his head right there. But there's the Hershey's kisses. See him? See that one right there? And these right here. One of the things that you'll find as you spend more time looking at photographs and thinking about this and really studying and thinking about what's important is you'll learn how to see these sorts of things. And as you move around, you'll see things that you probably would not have even seen at all previously. And that's kind of what we're after, because being able to be confident that when you walk along a trail, you're not going to accidentally stumble upon something, that's huge. As far as enjoyment of the outdoors. So learning to be able to pick out that pattern, and it's subconscious. Once you have enough practice, you can subconsciously, you know that something's there, and you kind of key in on it until you finally identify it. So that's kind of what we're looking for here. And this is a great photograph that just popped up recently, a neonate copperhead crawling up a tree. Copperheads do not climb very well. They don't climb, they don't enjoy climbing, they don't like swimming, they don't like doing things like that. They like to stay on the ground. That is not to say, however, that you won't find one off the ground, either swimming across a stream or up in a shrub, or in this case, going right up this tree by going right through that crack in the bark. And there's his head, and there's the crossbands, and there's our copperhead. It's even a juvenile. There's a yellowtail tip right there. Really hard to see unless you really pay attention. Table Rock, South Carolina. That's a really dark individual. Most of the copperheads in this area aren't this dark, but this one is really, really dark and would be really well camouflaged in an awful lot of our high elevation areas. But again, look for those features. I see the Hershey's Kiss or the hourglass shapes. There's the head. I can see angles. I can see flatness. I can see an angle on the snout. I can see the eyes directly out on the side. I see all the features that I need to see. I know that's a copperhead. Even in the same population, copperheads can vary widely in color, from really dark to really light. These two, not sure what's going on here. I don't know the details on this particular photograph. It's possible these two are emerging from a hibernaculum in this rock pile. The copperheads will often, copperheads, black rat snakes, and rattlesnakes will often share a deep underground den site over the winter here, completely oblivious to each other. So these guys may be emerging from a den. They actually may be mating. We don't know what's going on under that rock right there, but the beauty of this picture is it really does let you know that even in a very small area, the coloration can vary quite widely, but pattern remains the same. Another really alert looking copperhead, giving you a very nice coppery head and beautiful markings on the side, very pale. And one more copperhead with the gray on gray. They do indeed have these two little dots on the parietal scale there. Those dots are associated with the pineal gland, which is a daylight calculating organ within the brain of all vertebrate animals. Some don't have that. Some those spots are not present, but most of the time they are. Eyes on the side of the head, facing outward. You can barely see them from this upward position. Nice pointy snout, angle right there, flat on the side of the head. It's giving me all the features I need to see. So remember that I keep harping on things like color pattern. And you say, well, wait a minute, you kept talking about color pattern and never focus on one item. Is that okay? Is it okay for me to just look for Hershey's Kisses, for example, and let's say that's a copperhead, I see Hershey's Kisses, boom. Well, unfortunately with copperheads, you sometimes find things like this. This is an aberrant pattern. Only one crossband there and one there actually cross and make the classic hourglass. All these others are interrupted. They're not even near each other. They do give you the Hershey's Kiss, but they're not connected. You have to remember that genetics being what it is, sometimes you'll run into animals that don't always fit the mold. They don't always follow exactly the pattern that you've learned, and you have to be sensitive to that and aware of that. I look at this and I say, I'm suspicious. I see Hershey's Kisses. It doesn't look quite right, but I am suspicious. And then I follow up here and I see this head shape and I can't see eyes. And I say, okay, viper head, that's clearly a copperhead. So there's always the opportunity out there to run into aberrant color patterns in any snake species. But it's critically important to remember that aberrant patterns in venomous species can lead you to a misidentification, and the last thing we want is for you to walk up to an animal like this and not realize it's a copperhead simply because it doesn't follow all the pat rules that we see in the classic photographs. And again, remember when you Google a picture, like you do a Google image search for copperhead, you're going to get an awful lot of photographs that are just absolutely standard, typical copperheads. You might not see some of the aberrant patterns and some of the different colorations. So always remember that that is out there. Genetic variation exists in all species. And so you say, well, I don't, it's not a big deal. It looks like Hershey's Kisses. I totally know that's a copperhead. Well, what about this one? The Hershey's Kisses have been left in the car too long. They've all melted. And we get dark light, dark stripes. You say, wow, how would I know that's a copperhead? Well, let's look at the head. The head is screaming viper. All the features we learned before, there they are. And so this is why you cannot depend on one feature alone to help you with identification. You have to look at the total picture. And again, remember, with enough practice, that total picture will happen almost instantly in your head. You'll look at it and say, I recognize that, and I'm not putting my hands on that, and I'm going to walk around that. So this is a really cool aberrant copperhead, but hold on to your hats. Check this one out. That is amazing. That's an amazingly colored copperhead. I've never, until I ran across this picture recently, I'd never seen one that was so purely colored. I mean, there's no hints of blotches or spots until you get way back here. But the front of this animal is complete. That is just drop dead gorgeous. But look at the head. There it is, classic. Everything about that tells you I'm looking at a viper. So again, you have to remember to look at all your features, not just one. Don't just try to take the easy way out and pick one feature, because it may let you down. This is not going to be a lot of information about the medical considerations, but we can say some things that are agreed upon by literally everyone in emergency medicine. And that is, first of all, that it is a medical emergency. A copperhead bite is something to be taken very seriously. You don't just wipe some alcohol on it and move on. You go to the nearest emergency department at your earliest convenience. Copperhead bites, though, are rarely life-threatening in adults unless you have some kind of allergic reaction or something of that nature. What do you do if you are unfortunately tagged by a copperhead? First of all, get away. Don't try to kill it or capture it. A lot of people are bitten multiple times when they try to catch it, or they try to kill it, or they try to get in close and take a photograph of it. Viper bites are really obvious. Viper bites deliver hemotoxic venom, which begins the process of digestion. It hurts like fire. It swells, it discolors almost immediately. There is no question. If you've been bitten by a viper, there is absolutely zero question that that's what's going on. When you get to the emergency department, they don't need the snake, they don't need a photograph. They can look at it and say, dude, that's a viper bite, and they will begin treatment. Do not do any of the old standby Boy Scout handbook first aid types of actions. These are all have been proven by research and by experience in emergency departments. These have all been proven to be much more detrimental to the patient than beneficial. Tourniquets, cutting and sucking, ice packing. People have even thought that shocking them with an electrical shock, like jumper cables or something, would disable the protein. All that is nonsense. And don't give any kind of medicine, no alcohol, no Benadryl, no any other kind of oral medication. That just complicates the job that the doctors are going to have when you get to the hospital. Car keys are your =1 first aid trick. Get them out and get them to the emergency department as quickly as possible. Remember that swelling is going to take place, and it's going to be pretty quick. So if it's on a hand, make sure you get rings off those fingers so that the fingers aren't strangulated as they swell. If it is on a hand, immobilize that hand, immobilize the entire arm to cut down on the distribution of the venom. And then if you're alone, walk out. If don't run, walk. If you have a group with you, maybe they can help you walk. Maybe they can help you by carrying you, like these guys are doing. If you're in cell range, call 911. Let them know what trailhead you're coming out of. If you can't get to the phone, or if the phone is, if you're out of range, call as soon as you can. Emergency department will take care of it from there. But prevention is always the best medicine. Like I said earlier, mind your surroundings. Always, never be in a hurry. Always pay attention to where you're putting your hands and your feet, and watching out where you sit. An awful lot of people are tagged by venomous snakes by sitting on them. So always pay attention to where your body parts are going. Never be in a hurry. Always watch what you're doing and think about the fact that something that you don't want to come in contact with could be there. The forest owes you nothing, and it's not your living room, and you cannot assume that every square inch of that forest is perfectly safe and happy. You have to take responsibility for your safety. Appropriate footwear. Guess what? The #1 shoe type is, if you look at the Copperhead bite statistics in North Carolina and you look at all the details surrounding the bite, the #1 shoe worn by people who were bitten on the lower extremities by copperheads in North Carolina is a flip-flop. Even tennis shoes, even light canvas shoes would be enough to stop most copperhead bites, especially if you've got socks on. They're not very strong. Their fangs are not terribly long, and just minimal clothing may stop bites completely, or at least limit the penetration, and possibly keep one fang from coming in contact. There's all kinds of variables there, but it's very clear that proper clothing makes a huge difference in the risk of being envenomated. Pants, long pants, rather than shorts, will go a long way. And a very, very important one: if you're walking after dark, use a flashlight. For goodness sakes, don't stumble around in the dark without a light. We know that many animals are nocturnal. Copperheads are no exception. They spend an awful lot of time out after dark. That's why they have the vertical pupils, remember. So make sure you've got that light on your head or in your hand when you're moving around after dark, and that will go a long way to prevent problems like that. There's absolutely no reason to kill snakes when you encounter them on the trail. They're not going to chase you. Snakes don't chase people. Snakes are not going to jump at you. They're going to especially copperheads, are going to sit there and let their camouflage do its work. If they realize that they've seen you, or that you've seen them, just back off and give them some space. They'll move away. You're not in that big of a hurry. Just give them some time and let them move on. If it doesn't look like they're anxious to move, just walk around them. No snake can strike more than about half of its own body length. So a 3-foot copperhead has a bite radius of maybe a foot, maybe a foot and a half on a very good day. You can certainly walk around that snake 5 or 6 feet, and you're totally safe. It's absolutely not going to be able to do any damage to you, so just walk around them. Or just let them go on about their business. Take a good look, take some pictures, and just call that part of the experience. Killing copperheads is only really justifiable if you can't find somebody to relocate them from your yard, where you have the fear that that animal is a resident and possibly could come into contact with pets or children, or you. If I had a copperhead that lived under my porch steps, and I knew that if I stepped down I might step on it, and I wasn't able to find somebody to move it, dispatching that animal is certainly a very reasonable course of action. However, that's about the only time that's justifiable. So remember that they're all part of the local system. They're all part of the biology out there. They play major roles. They're not only predators, but they're prey, just like every other snake in western North Carolina, and they need to be protected whenever possible. Roads and humans that don't have the kind of consideration that you have. If you're still with me on this video, you clearly are interested enough to appreciate the natural world. So people that aren't as appreciative, all those things are stacked against the copperhead. So we need to make sure we protect them whenever possible. And I could not agree with this guy much more than that. That's a great message, and hopefully when we're outside, we'll see them, we'll recognize them, we will not run in blind fear, and we will appreciate them for the wondrous little animals that they are, and let them and us go on our merry way. So that's it for our look at the copperhead, and in the next video we'll look at the timber rattlesnake, the only other venomous species in this area. And hopefully between these 3 videos you'll be much more comfortable in your ability to separate animals such as these from all the many species that are harmless. So until next time, have a great hike, and I'll see you on the trail.